Alright, today we're briefly looking at ND filters for video, particularly ND stacking. Now for photo, you typically use ND filters to reduce the light hitting your sensor to allow you to shoot with a slower shutter speed, i.e. keeping your shutter open for longer without overexposing your shot. Now photographers use ND filters to take long exposure shots, predominantly landscapes, cityscapes, or whatever else to capture movement. Like in this example here, this photo taken outside in broad daylight. Here we are capturing a very tiny brief moment in time, and that's why you can see the bubbles, and that's why the image isn't overexposed. We have a fast shutter speed. I wanted to also capture a long exposure shot of this water. I made things difficult for myself and opted for a shallow depth of field, as you can see, meaning a wider aperture, in this case f1.7, and this particular shot here, not a long exposure shot, required a shutter speed of 1/8000th of a second. Now to get some form of long exposure from this scene, I was able to slow my shutter to a 25th of a second, but I used this a bunch of NDs stacked. Now the NDs allowed me to keep the shutter open longer while limiting the amount of light we would have otherwise had come through to hit the sensor, and this made it easier to achieve a long exposure shot while keeping the image appropriately exposed. Now with video, we generally want to keep our shutter at 1/double the frame rate. If I'm shooting at 25 frames per second, I'll set my shutter to 1/50 seconds or 180 degrees, and if I'm shooting at 50 frames per second, And if I'm shooting at 50 frames per second, my shutter will typically be set to 1/100 seconds or 180 degrees. But let's say I want to shoot outside in the sun at f1.7 to achieve a nice shallow depth of field. This aperture is wide and will let a lot of light through the pupil opening and will most definitely overexpose our shot. Now, as we want to keep our footage looking pleasing to the eye, generally we want to keep the shutter speed at this 180 degrees. So my 25 frame per second shot will be set with a shutter speed of 1/50 seconds. So we would technically have only the aperture and ISO to adjust our exposure. Now I'd like to leave the ISO at 400 for this, so the only thing I can do now is narrow my pupil opening and shoot at f22, but that would completely eliminate the shallow depth of field that I want, and my shot will still be overexposed. So we need to add shades to the glass to reduce the amount of light traveling through that's hitting the sensor, and this is where the ND filters come in. I have 4 with me. I have an ND8 which fits my 25mm. That's the only one I have for this lens, and I also have a step-up ring that I'll use to add this set of filters, which can also be stacked on each other. Mix and matching and combining these could help us keep our shallow depth of field with a shutter set to 180 degrees while shooting 25 frames per second in the midday sun. Now, some important things to note: these are cheapy filters, so the following might be limiting factors for us, and we will look out for these in the editing process. Color cast, I'm experimenting with 2 different brands. They will have different cast colors, and mixing them could be problematic. Flaring and ghosting, with each new glass element we add, we are adding more potential for flaring, and I would imagine this is also largely dependent on our position relevant to the sun. And vignetting, I suspect we will have less of a vignette problem while using a step-up ring with wider filters, but I think that in turn this will make flaring more likely. Okay, here we are outside, no filter, 25mm, f1.7, shutter at 180 degrees for our 25 frame per second shot, completely overexposed, no image data. Let's add an ND8 or a 0.9 ND filter directly to the lens. As you can see, we are getting some information now, but this is overexposed even with the 3 stops of light reduction. Now I'm going to add an ND2 to our step-up ring, and this will reduce another stop of light. Same overexposed still. Now let's add an ND4 to reduce another 2 stops of light, and we see our shadows coming out now. And finally, let's add one more, because this is all I have on me, another ND8, and that's another 3 stops of light. And now we have some footage to work with. If I'm not mistaken, this is 9 stops of light that we have reduced from the shot. Now to achieve anything like this with the camera using just the aperture, I can push it to f22, which is better, but still overexposed, and we have lost that shallow depth of field we wanted for this particular shot. As for color cast, there is nothing that some white balance correction in post can't handle. I moved around a bunch and wasn't too phased by the flares. I got flares in the obvious positions relevant to the sun, but I do know that based on what I have read, that flares can be a significant issue here, so do be aware of that. I wasn't hindered by vignetting either, and I think this is because most of my NDs were stacked on a step-up ring and were wider than my lens glass. But vignetting can be an issue, so do be wary of this. as well. And that's it for today, folks. If you're into the music I've been using in my videos lately, feel free to check out audio.com. Details in the description. Lifetime high quality music and sound effects for hands down the best value for money. If you found this video helpful, useful, entertaining, feel free to give it a thumbs up if that's something that you do. Share, subscribe if that's something you might be interested in doing, all that good stuff. As always, thank you so much for watching. I sincerely appreciate you for taking the time to be here, and I'll catch you in the next video.